All right, it's 9:01. I would like to welcome everyone to Safe Water Spokane's fluoride presentation and public forum. Uh, as we're going to have the schedule for this evening is as follows. For the first 45 minutes, you're going to hear a presentation from an expert panel of medical and scientific and legal experts on fluoridation. That 45 minutes will be followed by approximately 20 minutes of Q&A from any counselors in attendance. We'll let you, the public know, and the public who will be watching this recorded event on a later date, know which counselors are in attendance, so you can tell who is committed to learning about fluoridation. And after that 20 minutes, we're then going to open it up to Q&A from the public. And how you can submit a question easily is at the top of your screen. You will see a little Q&A box, and you can click on there and you can ask your question, and one of our two technical hosts will ask the question of the panelists. We're also going to be, for those of you watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can also submit a question by posting a question throughout this presentation or by direct messaging either our YouTube account or our Facebook account. So just an order of our presenters this evening. First, we're going to have Jeff Irish, the chair of Safe Water Spokane, followed by Chris Narath, the research director of the American Environmental Health Studies Project. He will be followed by Michael Connett, attorney Michael Connett, the attorney representing plaintiffs in the Tosca fluoride lawsuit currently in federal court against the EPA over the neurotoxicity of the additives used to fluoridate our drinking water. He will be followed by Paul Connett, PhD, professor emeritus, chemistry, and expert in toxicology and environmental sciences. After Paul, we'll hear from Dr. Bill Osmundson, a dentist with a master's in public health with over 40 years of experience as a practicing dentist in the state of Washington. He'll be followed by Dr. Robert Dixon, MD, family physician from Calgary, Alberta, with over 30 years of experience in that practice. He's also a co-founder of Safe Water Calgary. And he will be followed by Julie Sims, a victim of fluoridation who lives in fluoridated Seattle, Washington. So to kind of give you a preview of what some citizens of Spokane could experience if Spokane Council does approve fluoridation. So without further ado, I'm going to start with our first speaker, the chair of Safe Water Spokane, Jeff Irish.
Good evening. As Stu said, my name is Jeff Irish. I'm chair of Safe Water Spokane, the host of tonight's program. Our grassroots organization just started about a month ago and already represents hundreds of Spokane residents opposing fluoridation. From the start, we've had one focus, the science. So many of our volunteers, including me, have had the same experience. At first, we supported fluoridation because we were told it was safe for everyone. Then we learned from the science that it wasn't safe for everyone, and we changed our minds. Especially as a parent, you want the best for your children. No one wants to put a substance in drinking water that will hurt people. We all have the same goals: fewer cavities, proven safety, and not waste taxpayers' money. We have very serious concerns about unfunded millions of dollars and the probability that fluoridation will raise our water bills or cut funding for other programs that are far more effective and much more needed. These excessive costs are last thing that we need during these hard economic times caused by COVID-19. But the focus tonight is on our health. And for those of you still supporting fluoridation, we especially appreciate your joining us. You may be thinking, if fluoridation poses health risks, why does the government support it? In one sense, fluoride in water isn't any different than other toxins, such as lead, DDT, asbestos, and cigarettes. For everyone, one solid peer-reviewed science had shown their risks for decades, but the government delayed regulating them. Unfortunately, by the time the government acted, millions had suffered diminished quality of life and needless suffering and disease. The delays on fluoridation and increasing scientific evidence against it have been following exactly the same path. And the organizations that have endorsed it, I'm quite sure their members have never seen the information we're presenting tonight. If you only get one side of the story, you can't make an informed decision. We can all get fluoride in toothpaste and mouthwash, but no one should be forced to ingest a drug they don't want through their drinking water. Once it's fluoridated, the only alternatives are expensive filter systems or bottled water. This isn't fair to anyone, but it's especially unjust for low-income populations, including a higher percentage of minority families who can't afford it. They must put themselves in harm's way. They have no choice. This isn't right. We ask City Council to vote no on fluoridation, and we again thank all of you for tuning in to our expert panelists. We're up next.
Thank you, Jeff. And our next panelist is Chris Narath.
Hello, I'm the research director of the American Environmental Health Studies Project. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so what is developmental neurotoxicity? In brain development, it starts with just a few dividing cells and continues rapidly in a highly complex dynamic process through infancy. The rate of neurodevelopment in humans gets even faster in the first months after birth. The Harvard Center for Brain Science describes this formation of the wiring of our brains as staggeringly complex. Our own brains have tens of billions of neurons connected through perhaps 100 trillion synapses. There are many critical processes during neurodevelopment which all have to take place with precise timing and coordination. A disruption from a toxic chemical to any process, even during a brief window of time, can cause permanent harm. Reduced IQ is one symptom of such harm. This slide shows some of the many processes subject to disruption. The fetal brain and the infant brain are much more susceptible to disruption than the adult brain because of this exquisitely complex developmental process, but also because the blood-brain barrier, which can limit access of toxic chemicals to the brain in adults, is not well developed until after about 6 months of age. So subtle early life damage to the brain often cannot be repaired and can cause lifelong harm. Over the past 3 years, the National Toxicology Program, or NTP, has been doing a very thorough systematic review of fluoride's neurotoxicity. Their draft report was released last October, and they're working on a final version now. They have concluded that fluoride is a presumed neurotoxin in children. Their conclusion is based on a very large amount of evidence that would probably surprise most people who have not studied fluoride's adverse effects. The NTP identified 149 human studies and 339 laboratory animal studies. There are even more studies published since last year that are now being added to the review. It's worth comparing this NTP review of fluoride neurotoxicity to their reviews of other toxic chemicals, where they also reached conclusions of presumed hazardous. Fluoride turns out to have many more studies than any of these other chemicals. In their fluoride review, the NTP has carefully assessed every study and given them quality scores for how strong they are across several domains. They have concluded that 29 are strong, high-quality studies. In their terminology, they are at low risk of bias. This is not a situation where we have just one study, as fluoridation defenders will often claim. The green in this graphic essentially means good, high quality, low risk of bias for each domain. Yellow and red indicate highest risk of bias. This graphic comes directly from NTP and shows only the high quality studies. as you can see, because they're mostly green. And what did these studies find? So I've produced this summary. Of these 29 studies, 27 excuse me, found statistically significant adverse effects. This illustrates the high level of consistency cited by the NTP to support their conclusion that fluoride is presumed neurotoxic. Here, I've added colored downward arrows that are blue, purple, and black, and they indicate the exposure levels at which harm was found in each of the studies. The blue arrows indicate studies that found adverse effects at or below 0.7 parts per million milligrams per liter, water fluoride, or the equivalent in urine fluoride. And there were 10 of those. There were also 8 more that found levels below 1.5 caused harm, and the NTP considers anything below 1.5 to be directly relevant to exposures in the US. The black are at above 1.5. I now want to show some reactions to the rapidly emerging evidence that fluoride is neurotoxic and can lower IQ of children. The study which has received by far the most attention is the Green 2019 study published in JAMA Pediatrics in August 2019. The JAMA editor's reactions I found to be very revealing of where most people, including health professionals, beliefs about fluoride have been, and where they can move to when they have an open mind. I'm going to give excerpts from their podcast discussion of the paper.
The paper is about fluoride and maternal fluoride exposure during pregnancy and its effects upon IQ scores of children at ages 3 and 4.
Yes.
Which in itself is like a shocking title, because I had never known that there's even any concern that maternal fluoride use might affect children's IQ.
The traditional teaching when I was going through residency and my early professional career was that fluoride is completely safe. All these people that are trying to take it out of the water are nuts. It's the best thing that's ever happened for children's dental health, and we just need to push back and get it into every water system. So when I first saw this title, my initial inclination was, what the hell?
This was from Canada, and they picked some large cities.
I'm going to skip this one. This is just saying that they were surprised how much of the world does not fluoridate. Most of the world doesn't. I'm going to move on.
A 1 milligram per liter increase in the maternal urinary fluoride concentration was associated with a 5-point lower score on the boy's IQ.
Right. An effect size which is sizable.
Which is sizable.
On par with lead.
Right, it is. The effect size is really quite large, because I think you think about it really in terms of not the individual child so much as the shift in the curve.
Right.
And the shift in the curve now being shifted to the left for boys, that's a real concern. The results are really startling.
There have been other observational studies that have shown this, and there have been animal models as well that have shown this idea that fluoride could be a neurotoxin, which again was totally news to me. In fact, I thought it was junk science that anyone would ever say such a thing.
Okay, and this is just what they meant by the shift in the curve. There's a bell-shaped curve, and the tails of it, you'll get many more children with IQs below 70. They're going to need special ed and lots of other problems, and you'll get half as many people who are gifted, even with a slight shift. That's what they were talking about.
So if mothers now come into their doctor's offices and ask the pediatrician what to do, what are you going to say?
I think I would advise them to drink bottled water or filtered water, because it's not a particularly odious thing to do and potentially does reduce the risk.
Yeah. The other thing is that some people may not be able to afford bottled water. It could be a financial burden to some low-income families, and we need to think about that as well.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to get a lot of attention, and I'm very proud that you published it.
Yeah, it did get a lot of attention, and their conclusion, pregnant mothers should avoid fluoridated water. So I'm going to talk briefly about some individual studies science, and these, I believe, are some of the most important ones. This study from 2003 was the first study, the earliest one rated high quality by the NTP's review. As shown in the graph, as the water fluoride increased, there's fluoride along the x-axis, IQ steadily decreased, and loss of IQ even at levels below 1.5 milligrams per liter is shown in this. Now, this study from 2015 was the first to look at whether individuals with certain genetic variants were more susceptible to loss of IQ than those without the variant. It found a 5-fold greater loss of IQ for one gene's variant in that. The table on the lower left shows that for all the children in the group, this is combined with all variants, there was minus 2.4 IQ points for a 1 milligram per liter increase. But for the Val variant, that's the more susceptible one, it was negative 9.7 IQ points. So 5 times higher. And then of course the graph showing these more susceptible shows how steep a drop it is. And this is all well below 1.5 and even 0.7 milligrams per liter. And this variant is not rare. A quarter of the people have this variant. So we're not talking about a genetic disease that happens to 1 in a million people. This next study, Bashash 2017, was the first funded by the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, with grants totaling over $3 million. It's a very high quality study and found a large statistically significant effect of fluoride on IQ. The average loss was 6 IQ points for each 1 milligram per liter increase in mother's urine fluoride. The graph shows the dose-response relationship found for children tested at age 4 years. It also shows in the blue bracketed area the region of fluoride levels in the United States. People down here are likely drinking unfluoridated water, up here, fluoridated water. And this is the loss of a 6-point IQ loss for that difference. Now, as just one indication of the high quality and rigor of this study, this is a listing of all the potential confounders that were considered and adjusted for if necessary. They included lead, mercury, gestational age, mother's smoking history, mother's IQ, maternal use of drugs or alcohol, and diseases during pregnancy known to harm the fetus. This next study, published just a few months ago, is, in my opinion, the most concerning study yet. It was done in the same Canadian cohort as the Green 2019 paper in JAMA Pediatrics. But instead of estimating prenatal exposure to fluoride, it measured exposure to the infants between birth and age 6 months, which comes largely through infant formula when it's made up with fluoridated water. So, children given formula as infants lost 9 IQ points for each 1 milligram per liter in tap water fluoride. This dramatic reduction in IQ is larger than the losses from prenatal exposure. The possible reason is that infants in this period, brain development is actually happening more rapidly during the prenatal period, so may be more subject to disruption. The authors conclude that for infants, quote, in the absence of any dental benefits from fluoride consumption in the first 6 months, it is prudent to limit fluoride exposure by using non-fluoridated water to make formula. While most studies of fluoride neurotoxicity have looked at IQ loss, there have also been several that have looked at the association with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I'll discuss the most recent of these studies. This study, published last year, found a dramatically higher risk of ADHD in children living in fluoridated areas of Canada compared to those living in unfluoridated areas. The risk of having a diagnosis of ADHD was 300% higher in fluoridated areas. The study used data from a sample of children throughout Canada collected by the Canadian equivalent of the US CDC. An implication of these findings is that a substantial proportion of ADHD cases may be caused by water fluoridation. In summary, the overall body of scientific evidence for fluoride's developmental neurotoxicity, that is, harm to the developing brain, is overwhelming. I have 3 or 4 more slides if I have just another minute or two. What are the implications of an average loss of a few IQ points? Should we even care? I've calculated the loss of IQ points per year in the US from fluoridated water using the same methods used in a 2012 paper that looked at 15 other risk factors. For fluoride, I calculated a predicted loss of 5.4 million IQ points per year. Comparing this to the losses from the other factors, including the best known neurotoxic chemicals, lead, mercury, organophosphate pesticides, this graph shows that fluoridated water is responsible for a greater total IQ point loss than any of the other risk factors. The JAMA editors in their podcast weren't exaggerating when they said the effect of fluoridation on IQ is on par with lead. It may seem crass, but there are standard methods for estimating the total economic cost to society from IQ loss. The main economic harm arises from reduced lifetime earnings, which have been found associated with lowered IQ. I've calculated the annual dollar cost of water fluoridation in the US from the lowering of IQ. I won't go into the details, but it's worth noting that the EPA considers that a population-wide average loss of just 1 IQ point is an adverse effect that should be avoided. So when I did the calculations for the US, the proportion who are formula fed as infants and live in fluoridated areas, it works out to a total cost of over $100 billion per year. So should we care about the scientific evidence showing water fluoridation lowers IQ by a few points? Absolutely. Fluoridation is doing more economic harm than good, much more harm. The dollar cost far exceeds any economic benefit, dental benefit that water fluoridation could provide. And as the authors of the study on formula said, there's no dental benefit from fluoride prenatally and in infancy, since the teeth haven't even erupted yet. The environmental health harm from fluoridation is easier to avoid than almost any other environmental problem. Spokane can keep its water unfluoridated and save its citizens the risk to children's developing brains. I'm not aware of any other environmental harm that is so easily solved. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chris.
And I'll say, please submit your questions now, and later on we'll get to them.
Yes, Chris brings up a good point. We have a number of questions already submitted. I think one from a counselor, Counselor Cathcart. We will, after the presentations from our experts, we're going to open it up for questions from counselors. So you'll have a dedicated amount of time to ask whatever question you want of our panel. Our next presenter is attorney Michael Conant, an attorney at Waters, Krause, and Paul, and the attorney representing the plaintiffs in the Food and Water Watch versus the Environmental Protection Agency, currently in federal court over the neurotoxicity of fluoridation chemicals. So please take it away, Michael.
Thank you, Stu, and good evening, everybody. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, so today, and I might not be able to get through this, but I welcome questions if people have any about the case at the end of the today's meeting. So I'm going to try to go through as much as I can here in these 15 minutes. So first, some brief background about this case that we filed against the EPA. We filed the lawsuit in 2017. We filed it under a statute called the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. And under TSCA, EPA has the authority to ban the particular use of any industrial chemical that presents an unreasonable risk to human health. And we filed the petition to EPA on the grounds that, based on the data that Chris Neurath was just talking about, that fluoridation chemicals present an unreasonable risk of neurotoxic effects, particularly when the exposure occurs during the prenatal and infancy periods. And so we've been litigating this case for over 3 years. We've obtained statements under oath from the CDC, from the EPA, from the FDA, and others, including the manufacturers of the fluoridation chemicals. The court denied EPA's multiple attempts to dismiss the case. And in June of this year, we had a 2-week trial. And the court has not yet issued its ruling. And we can talk further about that later. So I'd like to start here by talking about some of the admissions that we have gotten from the federal agencies and the manufacturers of the fluoridation chemicals. And as I mentioned, we subpoenaed the FDA, we subpoenaed the CDC, we had a lot of discovery with the EPA, and we subpoenaed Mosaic, which is a manufacturer of fluoridation chemicals. We subpoenaed Solvay, which is a manufacturer of fluoridation chemicals, and we subpoenaed the NSF International, which is this quasi-public private organization that certifies the water treatment chemicals for safety. So here are some of the, I think, important admissions that we did get in this case so far. First is that fluoride, when the mother consumes it through water or any other source, the fluoride gets through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. And as Chris Neurath was talking about earlier, this is significant because the developing brain in the fetal period, in the prenatal period, as well as in infancy, is particularly vulnerable to the harms from toxic chemicals. Here you will see what was an undisputed fact in the case. This is the language that EPA agreed to in the case, which is that fluoride passes through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. No dispute about that, none. Next, another admission we got is that fluoride interferes with the brain. And you'll see here, I deposed the representative of the CDC in this case. His name is Casey Hannon, and he's the director of CDC's Oral Health Division. And in the deposition, I asked Mr. Hannon, so CDC agrees with the National Research Council that it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain and the body by direct and indirect means. His answer, yes, CDC in connection with the intergovernmental work. Another admission we got in the case is that fluoride is an endocrine disruptor. And the National Research Council discussed this at length back in 2006, including fluoride's ability to affect thyroid function, including lowering thyroid activity. And I also asked the CDC representative about the NRC's findings. And I asked him, so CDC accepts that fluoride is an endocrine disruptor. His answer was, we accept the NRC report as a summary of the hazard. Yes. So CDC accepts that fluoride interferes with the brain and it disrupts the endocrine system, including thyroid function. Another admission we got in this case, is that there's no known safe dose for fluoride exposure when you're talking about the brain, the thyroid gland. Now, you'll sometimes hear proponents of fluoridation talking about thousands and thousands of studies that show that this practice of fluoridation is safe. Well, in this case, we had the opportunity to subpoena the FDA, the CDC, the NSF, the fluoridation manufacturers, and the EPA. And to every one of these entities, we asked a basic question. Show us any safety data that you have which establishes the safety of fluoridation for the brain and for the thyroid gland. And all of those entities came up with no studies, none. And here I'll give you a couple of examples of the responses that we got. I asked the CDC representative. So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children. Answer, right. And I asked, that was part of a whole litany of questions similar to that, where he kept on saying, yes, we do not have any data on the upper tolerable intake of fluoride for neurotoxic effects. And what Mr. Hannon said in the deposition is the CDC doesn't do that. The EPA does. The EPA is responsible for getting that data, for figuring out what the upper level of exposure is. And the EPA, we also asked the EPA, and they didn't have any studies. Here's a response where we asked for all studies that demonstrate that fluoridated water is safe for the thyroid gland. EPA responds, it is not aware of any studies for the thyroid gland. For the brain, the EPA said they identified one study that demonstrated or supported the neurological safety of prenatal fluoride exposure. But the one study they identified is a study by Phyllis Mullenix from 1995, an animal study. And their own experts admitted that the Mullenix study actually found neurotoxic effects from prenatal fluoride exposure. Here's a response from the FDA. The FDA has not conducted or sponsored independent research concerning the risk of neurotoxicity associated with exposure to fluoride and does not have in its possession any internal scientific evidence concerning this topic. The FDA has no position on this topic. So the FDA is saying, don't come to us. We've not looked at this. We don't have any data. We don't have any position on whether fluoride causes neurotoxic effects. So a fifth admission that we received in this case is that there are no benefits from exposure to fluoride during the prenatal and early infancy period. And this is significant because this is the period of life, as Chris Neurath was talking about, where the risk of harm, particularly to the brain, is at its greatest. It's in the prenatal period, early infancy. And in this case, the CDC admitted they have no data at all to show that this period of life presents a benefit from fluoride exposure. So when you think about this from a risk-benefit perspective, and you look at these vulnerable populations, the pregnant mom, the bottle-fed infant, you're looking at a situation where you have a clearly identified risk with no benefit. Here is some of the testimony that the CDC gave. I asked, so the CDC's conclusion in 2001 is that they have good evidence, high quality evidence, to show that fluoride supplements do not provide a benefit for children when given during pregnancy, correct? Answer, yeah, when given to pregnant women. Then I asked, is the CDC aware of any evidence demonstrating benefits from consumption of fluoridated drinking water during the first 6 months of life? Answer, we are not aware of any evidence. And I'll repeat that again. We are not aware of any evidence. Now, this is the precise period of time where the developing brain is not protected by the blood-brain barrier, and we have epidemiological data showing a significant loss of IQ from exposure to fluoridated water during this time frame. So I think it's really important to keep in mind the absence of benefit during this critical window of life. And I may be running short on time, so I'm probably gonna have to speed up here. But just briefly, I want to show a table here which identifies what our experts consider the best studies available on fluoride neurotoxicity. And Chris Neurath discussed some of these. This is the Bischoff 2017, Bischoff 2018, Green 2019, Till 2020. Best 4 studies ever done on fluoride neurotoxicity. Well, lo and behold, the EPA says, yeah, these are the best studies ever done on fluoride neurotoxicity. These are the NIH-funded birth cohort studies. Each and every one of these studies was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And each and every one of these studies found significant and large adverse effects on neurodevelopment. Every one of these studies. So our experts say, these are the best studies ever done on fluoride neurotoxicity. EPA says, yeah, these are the best studies ever done. Results, every one of them finds significant and large adverse effects on par with the effects of lead. So who are the witnesses in this case? We were very fortunate to be able to call to the stand at trial Dr. Howard Hu, who has been funded by the National Institutes of Health for over 30 years. And he's an esteemed epidemiologist, and he has been leading the NIH-funded study on fluoride and neurodevelopment in Mexico. And so we asked Dr. Hu about his findings, and Dr. Hu confirmed that his findings, in his words, are consistent with and support the conclusion that fluoride is a developmental neurotoxicant at levels of exposure seen in fluoridated areas. That was what Dr. Hu's testimony was in this case. And Dr. Hu agreed that the effects of fluoride that he has found in his studies are on par with lead. We also called to the stand Dr. Bruce Lanphier, who is leading the NIH-funded study of fluoride and neurodevelopment in Canada. Dr. Lanphier has published the seminal studies on lead and IQ. Dr. Lanphier's studies on lead have been used by the EPA to set the EPA standards and regulations to protect us from lead. And he testified about their findings. Again, his findings from Canada show significant and large effects of prenatal and infant exposure to fluoridated water and reduced IQ. And we also called Dr. Philippe Grandjean, who's an environmental epidemiologist at Harvard. Dr. Grandjean reviewed the whole body of literature, and in his conclusion, the IQ losses associated with community water fluoridation are substantial and of significant public health concern. So we also, the EPA has scientists in the agency that do have expertise on fluoride. But what is notable about this litigation is EPA did not call them as experts in this case. Instead, EPA called experts from a consulting firm called Exponent. Exponent has been called a, quote, science for hire group, that the largest chemical companies in this country like Dow and Monsanto, American Petroleum Institute, 3M, DuPont, Syngenta, CropLife America, 3M, the largest corporations with chemical toxicity issues routinely go to Monsanto to give their chemicals a clean bill of health. And that's what EPA did in this case. They went to Exponent to defend fluoridation, not its own scientists. But at trial, we called EPA's own scientists to the stand to testify about their assessment of fluoride and the brain. And here you'll see some of their testimony. This is Dr. Christina Thayer, who is currently the director of the Chemical Pollutant Assessment Division. And I asked her, based on your review of the animal studies on fluoride in the brain, you agree that the animal data supports the biological plausibility of fluoride causing neurotoxic effects in humans, correct? Answer, yes. Then I talked, and then we introduced a testimony of Dr. Joyce Donahue, who is the chief scientist on fluoride at the Office of Water at the EPA. And I talked with Dr. Donahue about the new studies, these new NIH-funded studies. And she said, yes, these are well-conducted studies, and they warrant a reassessment of the current safety standards of fluoride. And here's just one of the questions I asked her when I was talking about one of the NIH studies. I asked her, and you would agree that this study further supports the need for reassessment of current safety standards of fluoride in the United States? Answer, yes. It is one of several. So at the end of this case, again, the judge has not made a ruling in this case yet. We still need to provide additional information. The case is ongoing. But when the trial was over, right after closing arguments on June 17th, the judge made a number of comments. And here's one of the comments he made. He noted, there is serious evidence here. There is no doubt that these two studies, the NIH-funded studies from Canada and Mexico, raise serious questions about this policy. So that's all I have right now. Again, we do not yet have the judge's decision in this case, but if the judge was to find an unreasonable risk, if the judge agrees that there's an unreasonable risk from fluoridation, EPA will be duty bound under the law to eliminate that risk. And the most obvious way to eliminate the risk posed by adding fluoridation chemicals to water is to stop adding them to water. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Michael. And our next presenter will be Paul Connett, PhD, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry at St. Lawrence University, where he specialized in environmental chemistry and toxicology and is also the co-author of The Case Against Fluoride.
Yes, I'd just like to add a little bit to my background here. I taught chemistry at St. Lawrence from 1983 to 2006 when I retired. And in 1996, my wife introduced me to the issue of fluoridation. I had resisted other people asking me to do this, but I couldn't say no to her. So I've been involved since 1996. And what's interesting about that date is that coincided with the publication of the first two IQ studies. So for the last 24 years, I've been following the IQ stuff very closely indeed. There are now over 60 studies which show a lowering of IQ. But the bombshell came, as you've heard from Chris and Michael, it came in 2017 with the NIH-funded studies. And hello, Spokane. I've been to Spokane 4 times, 1987, 1989, 2000, and 2003. 1987-89 was on waste management, and in 2000, 2003, that was on fluoridation. And in 1989, I flew in with Michael, who you've just heard from. He was only 13 at the time. And if we got time, he can explain the flight that we took to get into Spokane. Anyway, my task is to tell you about the chemicals that are used in fluoridation. And this is one of the absurd part of the story of fluoridation. There are many absurdities about water fluoridation. This is one of them. In short, they don't use the pharmaceutical grade chemicals as used in toothpaste and other dental products. They actually use, and this many dentists don't believe this, but it's true, they actually use a hazardous waste product from the fertilizer industry, the phosphate fertilizer industry. In chapter 3 in this book, you'll find, I give all the details and all the references to support what I'm about to say. The phosphate fertilizer industry, what do? They take phosphate rock, which is insoluble in water, and they solubilize it to get superphosphate, which they can use in agriculture. You've got to get the phosphate soluble in water so you can get it to the plants. And to do this, they use concentrated sulfuric acid. Now, the sulfuric acid releases the phosphoric acid, the phosphate ion, so that's the good part of the story. The bad part of the story is that concentrated sulfuric acid also releases hydrogen fluoride. It reacts with the fluoride in the phosphate rock to produce hydrogen fluoride. That in turn reacts with the silicon dioxide or sand in the rock to produce silicon tetrafluoride. Two gases, two very toxic gases, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. And for about 100 years, the phosphate fertilizer industry released these into the environment. And down in Florida, it damaged the citrus groves and crippled the cattle in the area that were eating the grass on which the fluoride was falling. So eventually, around about the 70s, I believe, the phosphate fertilizer industry was required to use a scrubbing system. It's very simple, a spray of water. And a spray of water converts these two toxic gases, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride, into an acid solution called hexafluorosilicic acid. The formula is easier to remember, H2SiF6, hexafluorosilicic acid. Now, this in the scrubbing system goes around the system until you've got essentially a eutectic mixture of 23%, approximately 23% solution. Now, that's their waste product, the hazardous waste product. They can't dump that into the sea by international law. They can't dump it locally because it's very, very concentrated. To get it down to 1 part per million, you have to dilute it with 100 to 1 gallon by 180,000 gallons of water. You need a dilution of a 180,000 to 1. Now, where had you got such a large supply of water to do this massive dilution? Answer, the public water supply. Now, there's a vagary in hazardous waste regulations in the United States which allows this nonsense to occur. And that is the chemical industry is allowed to and encouraged to sell its chemical waste, its waste chemicals, hazardous waste chemicals, to other industries. A very sensible idea to keep the hazardous chemicals keeping within the industry and not in the environment. But in this case, when you do that, when you sell your chemical to another industry, it's labeled a product. And on this basis of someone buying this hazardous waste chemical, this hazardous waste chemical is now classified as a product and no longer has to meet hazardous waste regulations. So the public water supply allows the phosphate fertilizer industry, instead of the headache of getting rid of a hazardous waste or storing a hazardous waste, of actually making a profit from the hazardous waste. And so this stuff now goes into our drinking water, goes through our bodies, into the sewage treatment plant where it's not removed, eventually into rivers and streams, and eventually into the sea. So they can't dump it directly into the sea, but they're allowed to put it into our bodies and then through our bodies out eventually to the sea. It's not going to do any damage to the sea. You cannot increase the concentration of the fluoride in seawater with fluoridated water. We fluoridate 0.7. The level of fluoride in the seawater is 1.3. You will never increase the concentration of fluoride in seawater. You might have local impacts, and I think I've run out of time. Happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Connett. Our next speaker is Dr. Bill Osmondson, DDS, general and cosmetic dentist, who's been practicing in the state of Washington for over 40 years. Bill Osmondson?
Where's Bill?
You may unmute, Bill.
I don't see Bill's video icon here, so it looks like he doesn't have his video. Perhaps we can get something sorted with Bill and skip him.
Yeah, in the meantime, as we wait for Bill, we'll move ahead to Dr. Robert Dixon, MD, a family physician from Calgary, Alberta, with over 30 years of experience and a co-founder of Safe Water Calgary.
Thanks, Stuart, and hello, folks. Hello from beautiful Calgary, Alberta. My name, as mentioned, is Dr. Robert Dixon, also known as Dr. Bob, and I'm the founder of Safe Water Calgary for the last several years. I've been studying water fluoridation, working on water fluoridation, and co-leading this water fluoridation movement in Calgary for 21 years now. I was advised a year and a half ago by our College of Physicians and Surgeons here in Alberta, which is our licensing body, to mention every time I talk about fluoridation that mine are not the commonly accepted views on water fluoridation. So I've asked them numerous times, what are the commonly accepted views? And I have yet to get an answer from them. So I'll let you make that decision. 98% of British Columbia, north of you folks, 98% of Quebec in the east of Canada, 97% of Europe, and 95% of the rest of the world do not use artificial water fluoridation. So what are the commonly accepted views? I think mine are. This slide by the data from the World Health Organization, that should end fluoridation right there. No questions asked, because those are all the major Western countries that are fluoridated and not fluoridated over the last 50 or 60 years, showing that cavities and caries come down at exactly the same rate, whether you're fluoridated or not. So water fluoridation has nothing to do with the decrease in cavities and caries over the last several decades. Here's my rationale and our medical rationale for being concerned about artificial water fluoridation and fluoride: safety, efficacy, ethics and morality, and of course the economics. And those have been touched on to in various ways by the previous presenters. And as mentioned, there's thousands of studies now showing harms and side effects. Virtually every cell and system and organ in the body is affected by fluoride. And as a medical person, that really concerns me. 60 studies showing loss of IQ. Two important points there at the bottom: fluoride is not a nutrient, and it is not a food or supplement, and it is not needed for a single body function. That's very important, folks. Not needed for a single body function. Remember that when people talk to you about the optimal dose of fluoride or how fluoride is necessary. Not true. The efficacy has been touched on. Very little efficacy, and that's even with the gold standard Cochrane collaboration that did their study 5 years ago. Only 3 studies had been done since 1975 that had any degree of credibility at all, and they were just mediocre studies. So the pro-fluoridation is often used percentages because they sound better, but that actually equates to only 1/2 to 1 cavity usually decrease in a lifetime, and that is not worth your brain, your thyroid, your bones, your kidneys, and other things that are affected. For me as a doctor, ethics and morality are of utmost importance, and that's how we actually won the day in Calgary in 2011 when we got fluoride turned off here, and it's been off for the last 9 years. The councilors said that they didn't know science, they weren't scientists, but they could make the decision on ethics and morality because that's something that they were trained in and that they were good at. And so they did not want to mass medicate all the people in the city of Calgary, 1.2 million people, with a toxic substance that has no control of dose or dosage, no monitoring, no follow-up, and no informed consent. Not moral, not ethical. We crunched our costs over 20 years, probably around $8.8 billion cost for the harms and side effects of fluoride. Lots and lots of scientists and professionals are against fluoridation. Here's 14 Nobel Prize winners that are against it and object to it. Dr. Albert Schatz, the co-discoverer of streptomycin, said, fluoridation is not one of, but it's the greatest fraud that's ever been perpetrated against society. So here's our message from Calgary. This doesn't say POTS, this says stop. This says stop it. It says fluoridation, don't swallow it. If you want to get more information, you can go to our safewatercalgary.com files, and there's an excellent report we gave to City Council last year. I'd implore everybody out there to watch the 2019 movie Dark Waters. It's about a lawyer who single-handedly tackles DuPont and their fluoride dilemma. And my last message to you is this: communication is so important, folks. We got to communicate the toxicities and get rid of this, put fluoridation, water fluoridation where it belongs, in the Museum of Failed Medical and Dental Policies. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Julie Sims, who's a resident, I believe, of Seattle, Washington. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and has hypersensitivities to fluoride and can kind of give folks a preview of what some residents may experience if Spokane fluoridates. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Thank you for allowing me to speak this evening. My name is Julie Sims, and I currently live in Seattle, Washington. I've been a resident of Washington for over 20 years. I wanted to share my story tonight about how fluoride has impacted my health and also my life. I grew up in California, and when I put my timeline together, I figured out that I started drinking fluoridated water when I was about 7. I had my first migraine headache when I was 14, and I had no family history of migraines. It was very mysterious, and I went off to college in Chico, California, and didn't actually have any migraines at all when I lived there. But when I relocated back to the San Francisco Bay Area, the headaches started again. I didn't, of course, put all this together until later. At some point, I moved to Southern California, and I lived in an unfluoridated area where I didn't experience many headaches at all, usually just when I went home to San Francisco. But one thing in that time in Southern California is I actually voted to add fluoride to the water in Orange County. I believed it was safe and effective, and I just wanted to add that because I wouldn't say I had anything against fluoride at all when it was suggested to me in, let's see, about the time I actually relocated back to Seattle in 2001. My headaches started getting worse, and by about 2002, 2003, I had a migraine headache every day. And sometimes it was lower, maybe a 3, sometimes it was a 10, but the pain was pretty excruciating, and it impacted my life a lot. I quit one of my jobs thinking I just had stress. I went to a lot of specialists. I saw a neurologist, I had MRIs, and I was very, very dedicated to trying anything. I tried pharmaceutical medications, non-prescription vitamins, exercise, diet changes, acupuncture, massage. I mean, really everything, more sleep, less sleep, night guards. I actually even had dental work done thinking that maybe my teeth alignment was causing me to, have discomfort at night. So I tried all of these things. Some of them I really believed would work. I was really a big believer in some of the early medications that I tried, but the headaches persisted, the migraines were so painful. And by 2013, I had a friend suggest to me that maybe I should try to eliminate water fluoridation, basically all sources of fluoride. I was really skeptical. I didn't expect it to work, but I thought I had nothing to lose in trying. So I went to the natural food store. I purchased some reverse osmosis water. I got fluoride-free toothpaste, and so my journey began. About 3 days later, the daily headache that pretty much never went away. And within a couple of weeks, I felt like a totally different person. This sounds, I know how this might sound. How do I know? I did strict elimination diets for things. I was really good about making notes. Every time I reintroduced fluoride, I have had the same result. I have extremely painful migraines. I can't, it's interesting. It's like, it's hard to explain the pain actually, but it's a little bit different. And it usually accompanies like sometimes a skin rash. Sometimes I get like a kind of personal, but I get like urgent bladder. So it wasn't just the migraines that I think that were giving me these clues. So I've gone over this with my doctor, and she's agreed that I should continue to avoid fluoride. And so I have for over 7 years now. And since committing myself to this fluoride-free life, I have enjoyed long stretches of months and months without migraines. I can still trigger one if I drink too much alcohol or I eat blue cheese, but I'm really regimented, and I've managed to really get my life back in a lot of ways. So I take a lot of care when I cook, when I travel. I always avoid fluoridated water. So I estimate that this is an added expense to my household budget of about $800 a year. And that's for water filters. And I'm very fortunate that I can accommodate this. but I would imagine it would be a terrible hardship for other families. So I just want to go ahead and close by saying that I know from my own personal experience and years of trial and error that fluoridated water has harmed my health. My doctor knows this and agrees with me and advises me to avoid it. I've actually considered moving to Spokane in part because you guys don't have fluoridated water. It's a beautiful city, and I hope you'll keep it that way. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And now, oh, get a little echo, but now if Dr. Osmondson is available and ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we got it going. My goodness, what a conundrum here to try to get on to talk to you guys in Spokane. It's like I'm in a mission field out here in Bellevue, Washington. You know, I think Jay has some slides there for you that I'd like him to put on up. But I used to live in Sandpoint, Idaho. And of course, we did our shopping a fair amount in Spokane. One of the things I always admired was the great water in Spokane. I have a great admiration and family that lives right close there. So what I'm wanting to do here is, well, a wrong group, sorry. So I'm gonna just skip those slides there, Jay, because that's the wrong set of slides that got to you. Boy, technology is great for me. Anyway, the big kicker for me was the EPA union members. Now these guys are not the politicians. They're not industry appointed people. They are public servants. They're the scientists. And these scientists said back almost 20 years ago that fluoridation was an unreasonable risk because it was so toxic. And when I first read that, I thought, you know, it is an unreasonable risk if you get too much. And then they said, and that the fluoride lacked benefit or very little benefit, and if there was any benefit. And that was a real tough one for me to swallow, so to speak, because I had always found that I could see in patients' mouths that fluoride was beneficial. And I had this game I played with my employees that I could guess where they lived, the patients to come in without looking at the address, because some of them had good teeth and some of them didn't. And all I did was look to see whether they were on fluoridated water or not. I was sure, but I was wrong. And why was I wrong on that? Because I was comparing the wealthy and the poor. I wasn't including socioeconomics. I wasn't including other factors that were a problem. And so when I saw this with the EPA, I thought, I've got to learn more. If they don't think that it's safe, I've got to do more study. So I looked at the FDA. What did the FDA say? Well, I picked up my toothpaste and I looked at it and said, do not swallow. Well, how much is of a concern to the FDA? Now, these are good scientists also. These are not politicians. They're not industry that are trying to promote something. What is the concern to the FDA? And the FDA had a concern of 1/4 milligram of fluoride, a pea-sized amount of toothpaste. Do not swallow. That's the same amount of fluoride that Spokane is considering giving in every glass of water to every person. Now, we should drink 6-8 glasses of water a day. So that's 6-8 times as much fluoride as the FDA is concerned. Wow, this became more and more of a challenge to me, as finding somebody where they were consistently saying that it was safe and effective. Only my public health profession and my dental profession, who were not looking at the science, kept saying that it was safe and effective. If we look at the science, we'll not fluoridate the water. But you have to look at both sides. You can't just cherry pick it for one side. Like the other panel members here, they're phenomenal members. These guys have studied this issue of fluoride far more than any other or most other subjects in their lives. Thousands and thousands of hours, and we've got to look at both sides of this issue. I treat dental fluorosis. Many people are getting too much fluoride even without getting fluoridated water. So why would we want to give more fluoride to people when they're showing us signs of a toxic excess amount of fluoride? I treat dental fluorosis. I diagnose dental fluorosis. This is a biomarker of too much fluoride. It makes no sense when, according to federal studies, 1/3 to 2/3 of all children are getting too much fluoride. Why would you give somebody anything if they're showing signs of too much fluoride? And this goes to everybody. I am very concerned about the poor. I help the poor a lot. I've done a lot of dentistry for poor people, and it's a real concern. Take Port Angeles, for instance. Delta Dental went on in there and quietly convinced the city council to, yes, sign a contract. 10 years of fluoridation with Port Angeles. Why? In part because they were having a crisis in their hospital of children, low-income children going in and having to have general anesthesia. Terrible. Emergency rooms visits. Terrible. Of so many children with toothaches. And what happened? After 10 years of forced fluoridation, they almost lost their jobs, they almost got kicked out, but the fluoridation stopped because, well, the people did not want fluoridation. But what about the poor? What happened to them? Actually, the hospital records show that there was an increase in hospital admissions and surgeries because from the 10 years of fluoridation. It didn't help. Boston, at several other cities report a crisis of dental caries after decades of fluoridation. Kentucky was awarded 50 years award by the American Dental Association of 100% fluoridation, but they're number one in edentulous patients, those people without any teeth. So how is this really benefiting people? There's so many things that are involved with this fluoridation, so many streams of evidence that we have to include. And it takes a lot of time. But the people to trust, because it is a big subject, you have to rely on somebody. The people to trust would be the Food and Drug Administration. They're the ones that evaluate the efficacy, which they say it's incomplete on the evidence. Then at that efficacy level, they look at the dosage. How much does it take? And at that amount, is it safe? And they say it's not effective at any level that's been applied for. The EPA,
30 seconds.
Look at the scientists. Okay, thank you very much. We'll go on to questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Osmondson. And now, if you're a city councilor, please raise your hand, and Jay will elevate you to a co-panelist, and we'd love to get any questions that you have. So Jay, I see Councilor Michael Cathcart is an attendee.
All right, Michael is promoted.
And if we have any other councilors, now's the opportunity to raise your hand. I want to let the public know that we notified the city council. We invited them numerous times, and we even prior to this event, we asked to present before the city council, just as the pro fluoridation side had two presentations dedicated just to their speakers and their PR agents. And Councilor Beggs unfortunately rejected our request. So that's why we're holding this event. And again, it looks like Councilor Cathcart is the only councilor who is in attendance at the moment.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks for allowing me to ask some questions. And I've got lots of questions. You guys have probably seen some of those that I've posted up on my city council Facebook page, and I've been trying to ask wherever I get the opportunity. And after some of this presentation, I've probably got more questions, and some of those I put in the Q&A little option there, and I know there's been a couple of responses, so I appreciate that. Maybe the first thing, because it's something you guys did not address, and I'm just curious about, is have there been further studies, credible studies that would validate some of the insinuations that there might be a nexus between fluoride and like hip fracture, like reduction in calcium, so harmful to older individuals, so not just children with the IQ, but older individuals, and then also any nexus between fluoride and cancer. I know there was a couple of studies in the early 90s that some have said are not credible, but I'm really curious about if there have been others and what your thoughts are on that.
I could start with the answer for that. One, Michael, is just this, I think about a month or two ago, there was a relatively large study from Sweden that investigated the relationship between fluoride in water and hip fracture. And it found a significant association. And it looks to be a well-conducted study that I think really will need to be taken seriously. And the levels that it found, the association, I think, was around in the ballpark of 1 milligram per liter. So very relevant to the levels we add to water here in the United States. On the osteosarcoma issue, the bone cancer issue, in 2006, there was a study, a national case control study published by Harvard scientists, which found a significant relation, age-specific, and this is the key for bone cancer, age-specific analysis, where they looked at the relationship between children who were exposed to fluoridated water at each year up through age like 10, and compared it to their later risk of developing osteosarcoma during adolescence. And that study found that boys exposed during the ages of 6 to 8 had about a 5-fold increased risk of developing osteosarcoma during adolescence. Now, some have said, but it's mistaken, that that study has since been rebutted by follow-up studies. But the important fact is that no study subsequent to that, the Bassin 2006 study, no study has attempted to do that same age-specific analysis, where you are looking at whether exposure during a given year of life correlates with a later development of osteosarcoma.
Can I add to that? You know, in our book, chapter 18 goes into the history and politics of this whole osteosarcoma situation, and you might find that interesting. I would also add that hip fractures is, if you like, is a second effect of fluoride's impact on the bone or the musculoskeletal system. The first impact appears to be on the connecting tissue, the whatever that stuff is that connects with the bone. And I say that because the first symptoms of skeletal fluorosis, of which there are millions of cases in India and China from naturally high fluoride in the water, the first symptoms of skeletal fluorosis are almost identical to arthritis. And pains in the joints, pains in the bone. And of course, we have millions of people in the United States with arthritis, and nobody as yet has studied to see if there's an association between your exposure to fluoride and the incidence of arthritis. If you ask your doctor what causes arthritis, doc, they usually say, we don't really know, but we think it's got something to do with aging. Well, what also has to do with aging is if you're living in a fluoridated community, as each year passes, you've got more fluoride building up in your tendons, cartilage, and so on. So arthritis is one of those things which has never been studied scientifically, even by those agencies that are health bodies that have promoted this practice for over 70 years. They haven't done the science. It's only recently that the NIH has started to fund studies designed to see if there are effects. And that's been a major breakthrough. 2017 was a major breakthrough, not only in what they discovered, but the fact that the NIH, the National Institute of Health, was funding real studies designed to find out if there are real problems with fluoride exposure.
And this is Bill Osmondson. I'd like to add a quick note on that. If you do search on PubMed of cancer fluoride, you'll find many, many studies that are talking about fluoride and cancer. One of them was a shock to me when they were doing medications to treat cancer, treat patients with cancer. And they were doing studies to develop cancer treatment, and they needed animals with cancer to test whether the drugs were working or not. And so they added fluoride to the rat's diet to create cancer in these animals. So if they're using fluoride to create cancer to study cancer treatment drugs, we know that at certain levels it causes cancer.
This is Chris Neurath, and I wanted to address your question about a little bit more about hip fractures in elderly, because Michael mentioned just one study, but there's actually been many studies now. Some have not found it, others have, but it's very important to understand that the National Research Council in 2006 published their review of the toxicology of fluoride, and this is still considered the standard review of the science. And they looked at all the adverse effects, including bone fractures in the elderly, hip fractures, and they concluded that there was a risk of that from the evidence available at that time. So that's, you know, sort of the most respected authority on these things concluded there was a risk from fluoride.
Going back to the IQ discussion, and maybe you touched on this and I missed it, but why is it that, and I asked this a little bit in my little Q&A thing here, but so there's a New Zealand study that apparently suggests that there's no impacts, and I've seen some of the fluoridation proponents put out there that is the only credible study that has ever been conducted on IQ. So I'm curious, one, why or how can they in good conscience say that? Two, obviously there have been other studies. I have seen them myself. I'm not a scientist, so I don't necessarily understand all the nuances of what they concluded, but I've seen the studies. And so what would be their argument as to why those studies are not credible? And I guess how do you put all that together to come to a real firm scientific conclusion?
Can I start out on this one?
Yeah, I'd love to also.
Yeah, and I believe, Bill, you were a co-author of me on a letter to the editor on that New Zealand study, which pointed out the problems with it.
Oh, so many problems.
So that New Zealand paper, even before we talk about any of the specific reasons why it was not a adequate study to even make a determination, this NTP review, the National Toxicology Review, which is ongoing right now. As I pointed out in my slideshow, they have very carefully rated every study on all sorts of domains, and this is their systematic method of doing it. This is sort of the gold standard for this sort of thing. That study from New Zealand rated low quality, high risk of bias. It didn't make it into those 29 that I showed, which were all the high rated ones. That's their rating, not mine. Now I could get into some of the details of why they rated it lower, but I'll just mention the one that I think is most important. The fluoridated kids did not have significantly higher fluoride exposures than the non-fluoridated. In New Zealand at the time, fluoride supplements were given to kids when they didn't have fluoridated water. And other studies showed that at the time, those supplements would actually give them as much fluoride as somebody drinking fluoridated water. The other aspect is prenatal exposures were not measured by that. And New Zealand has some of the highest tea drinking consumption in the world. Tea is very high in fluoride. So the mothers in the non-fluoridated areas could have been getting virtually as much fluoride as the mothers in the fluoridated areas. In other words, that study from New Zealand didn't have any contrast in fluoride. They weren't able to see a difference in their IQs because there wasn't much difference in their fluoride exposure.
So, Chris, I think it's important to say once again, the study really compared fluoridated water with fluoride tablets, and they found no real significance in IQ. But they weren't comparing low fluoride and high fluoride.
That's a good way of putting it.
I would also note there that in that New Zealand study, the broadband study, they had their assessment for fluoridation exposure was based on one snapshot in time at age 5, or where the children where they did not have residential history for age 5, they used a residential snapshot at age 3. That's all they had for their fluoridation exposure. No individual measurements. So they didn't have urine levels, blood levels, water intake data. It was just, where did the child live at age 5, in a fluoridated community or non-fluoridated community? And that becomes really significant when you look at the fact that what's the most vulnerable period of exposure for fluoride? It looks to be the prenatal period or the infancy period. And the broadband study had no data whatsoever on the exposure to fluoride during that critical window of development.
So another question is regarding allergies or sensitivities to fluoride. So I know we had a gal on talking about her experience with fluoride, and what I'm wondering is there any actual documentation that either she has or similar individuals that really kind of backs up from a medical perspective that it was in fact fluoride that was the causation, and it's not just assumed to be fluoride for whatever reason? And then also just related to this, so I've seen the studies from, I believe it's the 60s and then one in the 70s that were done that showed, I believe it was something like 1% or some small number, but still a good number of individuals would likely have some sort of sensitivity to fluoride. But then again, I also hear the proponents of fluoridation say, no, there is no evidence whatsoever that there is anybody out there with any sort of allergy or sensitivity to fluoride. And so I'm curious, what is it about those studies in the 60s and 70s that they would suggest are not credible? And have there been other studies since then, because I've looked and I really haven't seen much, that would address sensitivities and allergies to fluoride?
Well, the studies you're referring to by Feltman and Kossel, and yes, 1% showed they gave tablets and they gave a placebo to the kids, and they found that 1% had skin rashes, neurological symptoms, and so on, very much along the lines that Julie was talking about. But I think when it comes to credibility, the health authorities that have promoted this practice for over 70 years, and I'm talking about health authorities in fluoridated communities and countries like New Zealand and Australia and the United States and Canada and so on, not one of those health authorities, and this is their practice, which they promote, has ever attempted to put this sensitivity issue on a scientific level, even when people have volunteered to be guinea pigs, as I know that happened in Victoria, Australia. There was a woman there, Valentine, I've forgotten her first name. She offered to be a guinea pig to the Department of Health, saying, I am sensitive to fluoride and I'm willing to have that proved. You know, you test me. And the health department that had denied any notion of sensitivity, absolutely denied it, said that they couldn't do that because they didn't want to risk her life, because she went into shock. I can't pronounce the word, but that shock that you get, you need an EpiPen.
Toxic shock, yeah.
But she was prepared. She was prepared. She says, have the pin, the EpiPen ready, you test me. And they wouldn't do it.
One other thing that those studies in the 60s and maybe into the 70s, those ones, Feltman and Kossel that Paul just mentioned, those were high quality studies. They were intended to look at the dental effects, benefits, But they did check for side effects, unlike most studies of cavities and fluoride. And it was funded by the Public Health Service, the US Public Health Service. And when they published those findings that 1% of their subjects were hypersensitive, and that was very rigorously the way they did that, their funding was taken away. So it goes along with, they're not willing to do a study, and if a study that they happen to have funded finds this effect, they cut the funding. And so that's why there is not evidence more recent of this effect on hypersensitive people.
And if I could just add to that, Michael, the National Research Council in its 2006 report, as well as a follow-up 2009 report by the National Research Council, they credited these case reports that were not just done by Feltman and Kozel, but by George Walbott, as well as Grimbergen, 1974. But case reports which in the NRC's own language, the way they describe these case reports is that they were quasi-experimental studies. And by that, they meant the studies involved giving fluoride to a patient under double-blind conditions where neither the patient nor the doctor knew whether the patient was getting a placebo or fluoride. The symptoms were then recorded, and a correlation was found between the fluoride exposure and the symptoms. So the NRC, this came up in our trial this summer, and that the NRC found those case reports to be credible studies that are supportive of hypersensitivity to fluoride. Now, unfortunately, there hasn't been much research subsequently to really flesh this out. But those studies that were done in the 50s through the 70s, despite what some proponents say, are credible studies, and the NRC concluded as much in 2006 and 2009.
And I'd like to add to that too, if Rick North is here, he could comment on that. Rick has studied extensively Dr. Hans Muhlenberg from Holland, and he did significant studies on hypersensitivities and found up to 5% affected patients and clients. And that is huge if you look at the number of people in your city, if you have up to 5% being affected. Rick can send you those studies.
I'm worried about 1%, so 5%'s much worse.
Rick can send you those studies if you like, and it's huge. And he was also very instrumental in having fluoride removed, banned from Holland. As you know, 97% of Europe is not fluoridated, and those are some of the studies that contributed to that taking place, that they actually said, no, thank you, we don't need it.
So, I mean, there's a lot of branches I could branch off from all these questions, but just in terms of tooth decay and kind of looking at this from more of a health or dental perspective. So I guess, are there studies that show that communities, and you've kind of referenced this, but communities that don't fluoridate and have very little to no naturally occurring fluoridation in the water compared with other communities that do, that there's no basically correlation between the rate of tooth decay between those two communities is I guess my question. And then secondary to that, is there anything that you have seen, I'm just curious just from your experience, that you have seen in those communities that do not fluoridate that they are doing to try and improve the rate of tooth decay amongst particularly low income populations, but just the community as a whole there?
I answered you in the Q&A part there, actually. If you look at the Scottish Child Smell Program out of Scotland, that has no water fluoridation at all, that they have probably the best kids' health and tooth health on the planet. And they have no water fluoridation, but they have an intensive program that starts when they're 3 years old, and it teaches kids about dental health, tooth health, oral health, and whole body health. And therefore, their health right across the board is much better. No fluoridation at all.
I'd like to support Bob's conclusions there, because my wife and I in 2018 actually went to Glasgow to visit the headquarters of the Child Smile program, and we were very impressed. And the thing is that exactly, it wasn't just teaching the kids how to brush their teeth and get into good habits and do it at the class level. I mean, there was a period in which all the kids brushed their teeth together, but they also taught them better diet and got away from all the sugar and the soda drinks and so on. But the most important thing is it was getting access to the parents, which is the key money saver here, because the biggest cost in children's tooth decay in children under 5, as I understand it, is baby bottle tooth decay. This is the big cause of children having teeth extracted under anesthesia. It's very expensive. It's very traumatic for the children. And this baby bottle tooth decay is caused by babies sucking on bottles of fruit juice, milk, even milk, and Coca-Cola, heaven forbid. If the baby sucks on it for an hour or two, it rots, and you can always tell it. You can tell when the dentists don't understand what they're doing. They hold up pictures of baby bottle tooth decay and say, look, if you don't fluoridate your water, this is what's going to happen to your kids, you cruel people. But the pictures they hold up are baby bottle tooth decay, and this is how you tell. In baby bottle tooth decay, it's the top teeth that rot to the gum, and the bottom teeth are hardly touched because of the bottom teeth are protected by the delivery system. So you can tell. And now here's the story. If you have access to the parents, you've got your best shot at getting them not to allow this bad habit to accrue. And that's one of the reasons why the Child Smile program, whilst on the one hand of now getting better dental statistics in every category than New Zealand, which has been about 40% fluoridated for many, many years, better statistics on tooth decay on the one hand, and saving a lot of money on the other hand, I think primarily by reducing the number of children that get their teeth extracted under anesthesia.
I'd like to add some more here. I mean, this is a huge subject, and you guys have done a tremendous job of touching on a couple of things, but one of them is Delta Dental does not pay for preventive dental education. They'll pay for fluoride to be added, but they won't pay for training and educating parents on the baby bottle caries, etc. So dentists who are busy and wanting to make a living, they're going to just avoid things that they don't get paid for. So that's one thing. But and the Child Smile program and these other programs are what we should try to strive for. That's ideal. But there are some very basic, simple things that can be done that don't involve quite so much changes. One of them is to have free fluoride toothpaste. Now, the FDA has approved fluoride toothpaste. Instead of putting millions of dollars into fluoridating the water, have the city say, for those who can't afford toothpaste, we have some here and you can have it at no charge. Wonderful to help them out. It is an approved source. Second thing is, like Paul has mentioned, one of the big problems is soda pop. The acids dissolve the teeth. I have some patients that are drinking many, many cans of soda pop every day, and they have a lot of problems with their teeth. Okay, what we need to do is tax that soda pop, and it can be done, and it has been done. The city could simply say we're having a small tax on soda pop, just like we put taxes on tobacco, and that is going to help pay for some dental offices that the city can set on up. I mean, it costs about $500,000 a year to run a dental clinic free. And you're going to put millions into fluoridation. You could set up some dental clinics and run those. A small amount of tax on soda pop could pay for free dental education and treatment. There are options that can be done. You could do fluoride tablets if you wanted to, and those people who want fluoride can have it. It makes no sense to give everybody fluoride when we have a third to 2/3 of children showing biomarkers of too much fluoride. Why are we giving more people more fluoride? Makes no sense.
So you touched on it. And I want to jump back on the fluoride toothpaste and fluoride supplements, fluoride tablets. So from what I have seen, and I just want to get some input from you guys. From what I have seen, it's the ingesting of fluoride that's most dangerous. But when fluoride is topically applied properly, that there is a big health benefit and not a lot of risk of some of the things we talked about, the neurological issues and other. Is that accurate?
Well, that's a simple way of being accurate. Yes, I would agree with you. And your questions are excellent. Okay, topical fluoride is approved by the FDA, and it does show some benefit when you're doing it with toothpaste. However, when you go to the dental office and we paint fluoride on the teeth, it's much higher concentration, and all of that is swallowed. When you're talking about toothpaste, the FDA says do not swallow. Why? Because you can get way too much fluoride when it's swallowed. So those are real key factors. Yes, topical has some more benefit than swallowing. And swallowing, there's not a single prospective randomized controlled trial on fluoridated water. That's one reason why the FDA says, sorry, the evidence is incomplete. Those studies could be done. Difficult? Oh yeah, but they could be done, and they haven't been done. The other thing is Delta Dental and all the other dental insurance companies, they have tons of data on cost savings, but do you see them publish that data? Do you see, when I looked at the costs for treatment in Spokane and Seattle and all the other counties, King County, et cetera, going all around Washington State, costs for dental treatment don't go up or down based on fluoridation of water. King County's been fluoridated for years. You have a huge increase in fluoridated people here, but does the dental decay rate go down here? No, I can't see any benefit when you compare the counties in Washington State.
Is that data available anywhere to compare the cost?
I can send it to you.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, I could keep branching off on these questions, but I mean, you guys have really touched on the high points. I'm happy to sit back and listen to kind of the further conversation here.
Your questions have been excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned more about fluoride in the last 3 weeks than I cared to ever know, and frankly, I still don't feel like I know much. So
yeah, I hear you. If it weren't my profession of public health and my profession of dentistry, I wouldn't be paying any attention to it either. But you know, public health is a unique. I like to explain it a little bit like car salesman. Public health is marketing. They don't look at the science of it. If you want to ask questions about your car that you want to buy, and you want to know about the type of metal that's used in the pistons, you wouldn't go to the salesman. They probably wouldn't know. You need to have the scientists that know the metallurgies, the hard facts there. That doesn't say that you don't need the salesman, but they're for a different purpose. The same thing with public health. Public health are marketing policy. They don't determine the policy. Dentistry, again, we're really wanting to help people. And so fluoridation is a knee-jerk reaction to helping people. But unfortunately, it doesn't help them. It harms them more than it helps them. You've asked questions about fluoridation and dental fluorosis and all these different types of things. It's really the brain that has the key to this whole thing. When we lower children's IQ by 3, 4, 5 points, you know, with your IQ, I can tell you're probably around 150, 140, my guess, on IQ. You lose 3, 4 IQ points, it's not going to make a big difference. But you get somebody who's already starting out with an 80 or 75 IQ, and you dump them into special education because you're trying to protect their teeth. It's not worth it. For every IQ point that is lost, you increase welfare, you increase special education, you increase people who are divorce rates, you increase social problems that are just terrible. The brain is sacred. We cannot harm the brain.
And, you know, I tried to cover this one issue, but I want to reinforce what Bill Osmundson just said. That study that I showed where the some people who had a particular gene variant had 5 times greater loss of IQ. A second study also found that with a different gene. For mercury and loss of IQ, they found this same thing. They found 25 times greater loss of IQ in children who had particular gene variants that made them more susceptible. So fluoride is very likely to be the same situation. So when the average loss of IQ over the entire population is 3, a lot of people will have none. But there will be 5%, 10% who will have a loss of 10 IQ points. Some will have a loss of 20. So again, you said you're concerned about the 1% who are hypersensitive. It's the same thing with loss of IQ. There are some children who will be seriously harmed. That's the way the science is showing on fluoride and on other neurotoxins. There's a wide range of susceptibilities. So you can't just dismiss it by saying, what does 3 IQ points mean?
Well, and so you, one more thing. So you mentioned when in reference to the New Zealand study that part of the issue is that a number of the participants were tea drinkers, and there's a lot of fluoride in tea. So I kind of assume a lot of this conversation is we're just going to accept that fluoride is in a lot of products that we consume, and essentially that it's going to be unavoidable to some extent, but what we can't avoid is putting it directly into the water supply and increasing the amount of fluoride that we take in. So if that's true, and if that's the case, is there, I mean, in your belief, should the public be going out of their way to avoid certain products to further reduce their fluoride intake?
Yes, water fluoridation.
Well, I would say there's actually not that many products that are high in fluoride other than products made with fluoridated water, processed foods. Tea is unusual, and it's only black tea pretty much. A few other things are known. Sardines, because the bones of the fish are sort of dissolved right in there, and bones accumulate fluoride. There's a few other things, but
mechanically deboned meat.
Maybe Julie would want to, discuss her own personal experiences. It is possible to avoid most sources, but fluoridated water is the hard one because it's not just in the water; it gets into everything.
I would say to follow up on that a few sources that I think, other than fluoridated water and processed beverages made with fluoridated water, I think a few sources of concern, especially for pregnant women, is drinking a lot of tea during pregnancy. I think that's going to become, and I think more attention is going to need to be placed on that. And, fluoride is used as a pesticide on grapes, and particularly white grapes, or for white grape juice and white wine. So people who drink a lot of wine, that can be a significant source if you're drinking non-organic wines made in the United States, because Europe doesn't actually use this fluoride pesticide on its grapes, but the United States does. Not all vineyards, but a lot of them. So that's, I think, can be a significant source, wine or grape juice. And then I think lastly, for young children, toddlers, preschool children, I think parents got to be really, really careful that when they brush their teeth, they are spitting out the toothpaste, because the toothpaste companies like Colgate and Crest, they are using adult strength fluoride toothpaste, marketing them to toddlers, putting the packages in cartoon with a whole bunch of cartoon characters, and using bubble gum and watermelon and grape flavors. So most parents are going to have no idea that they're dealing with a toxic product. I mean, the back, as Dr. Osmondson was mentioning earlier, these toothpaste in the fine print say, do not swallow more than used for brushing. If you do, contact the Poison Control Center immediately. And I think most parents using cartoon packaging toothpaste with bubblegum flavoring aren't going to know that there's a potential problem from their kid swallowing it.
And Michael, that's really, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, I was just going to, Michael Cathcart, I'm glad you used the words avoidable. And I'd like to bring this whole issue for Spokane back to common sense. In my previous issue, waste management, I was dragged into a subject called risk assessment. And for incineration, they would call in these consultants like Exponent and prove that the dioxin coming out of the incinerator posed no more than 1 in a million cancer risk and allowed the politicians to go forward. But the point was, they spent millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars doing these complicated scientific exercises that the citizens had no understanding of. It was beyond that. And I came in, I said, look, I'm going to give you a free risk assessment. It's only one sentence long, and everybody can understand it. And that was the following: no risk is acceptable if it is avoidable. And we're talking about a risk to children's brains, to their IQ. It's not necessary. There is no reason to push this on people. There's no reason to push this risk onto people. Now, there are certain things out there that are damaging children's brains today, which we have little control over. The mercury that's built up in various residues in lakes and so on that get into the food chain, that we can't unwind those sources of pollution in the past. But this is something now in the future. Do we or do we not have to risk damaging our children's brains? And the answer is no, you don't.
Last question. Now that you reminded me of one more. So what we're told is the reason that European countries do not fluoridate, it has nothing to do with fluoride so much as it is that because they have socialized medicine, everybody gets dental care, etc. So what I'm wondering is there actually other reasons why many European nations and other countries obviously have chosen, specifically not to fluoridate? Is it just because of their medical system, or are there some other reasons, studies, science, data that they're using to make that decision?
I would say we don't really need to speculate on this because we have statements from European officials, water authorities, health authorities, which explain in their own words why countries like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Italy, why these countries did not fluoridate. And when you listen to their own words, what you will hear is the primary reason Europe did not fluoridate its water is because they made the determination that fluoride, being a medicine when used to reduce tooth decay, that there is a fundamental right for people to choose which medicines they take, and that right is violated when you add it to the water supply. So that, if you look at the statements, and we actually have posted them online, if you look at the statements from the European authorities, that's the primary reason they give. It is a question of medical ethics. But there are countries like, for instance, in Denmark and Sweden, where they emphasize more, they were very concerned about the potential risks that were indicated back in the 70s and 80s when they made their respective decisions. So there was a concern about long-term chronic effects, but it was the medical ethics that I think really was the primary factor. That said, it's absolutely true that in Europe, they do have better access to dental care for children from low socioeconomic status. And, I think that in the United States, we need to really question whether we are respecting low-income communities by feeding into this notion that, hey, they don't need dentists. They don't need dentists to accept Medicaid. They don't need that. All you need to do is just dump an industrial chemical into their water supply, and there, go on your way, and you have your dental care now. I think there's a real, I mean, it's very convenient and easy for policymakers to take an industrial chemical and dump it in the water and think that you're dealing with the problem. But when you look at low-income urban areas in this country, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, you look at the tooth decay rates there and you will find very high rates. And you'll find severe, the baby bottle tooth decay. You have dental crises in low-income fluoridated areas, which begs the question, if you have oral health crises in low-income fluoridated areas today, why should we believe that adding fluoride to Spokane's water is going to prevent an oral health crisis in low-income children there? It's not going to happen. It hasn't happened across this country.
That's right.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We're going to try to take some questions from the general public. We've promised them an opportunity to ask questions, and we have a lot on our plate here. So we offer a warm thank you to Councilor Cathcart for his participation and for looking at the issue from all perspectives and researching the issue as well. So I'm going to start out. I'm looking at the questions. We got a number of questions from participants. I'll start out with those. And then if we have time, I'll move to the questions that we received from our supporters who are also watching this live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. So the first question says, Portland engineers estimated it would take the addition of 215,000 pounds of chemical fluoride added to the water supply annually in order to reach optimal fluoride levels. How much in tonnage or pounds would be dumped into Spokane's water on an annual basis? Does anyone want to give this one a go?
I just say that however many gallons Portland uses of water, they fluoridate. They don't fluoridate. Portland doesn't fluoridate their water at all. So I'm a little bit confused.
I think they were saying Portland engineers had estimated if they had fluoridate.
Yeah. So if they use 1 billion gallons of water a year and Spokane uses 1/10 of that, then it would be 1/10 of that. That's about as close as I could give an answer to that.
Well, I kind of look at the question as is most of the water that's fluoridated goes out onto lawns and to wash cars and to other things besides actually being drunk. So you also have to separate out what goes into the sewer, which would then go into the river. I think that's part of what they're asking.
If it did work, it's a really poor way of medicating people because 98 to 99% is not consumed. So only about 1% to 1.5% is actually consumed. So if I as a doctor gave you 100 pills and said throw 99 of them in the river and take one of them, I think you'd be shaking your head and questioning that.
Another way to address that question is, I believe there are estimates for how much the chemicals in Spokane would cost. And whatever amount it is, it's a significant amount of money. So it will cost.
All right. Yes. And just for clarification, it's $600,000 annually would be the fluoridation additive, according to the Public Utilities Director. And they're estimating somewhere between $4 and $6 million in startup costs. And the Delta Dental contract would require 20 years of fluoridation. So we're talking cumulatively $18 million would be spent on fluoridation over the course of 20 years. Now, the next question comes in, it says, when I was 3, I lost a kidney. I grew up with fluoridated water. I also have been on thyroid medication for many years. Could this be related to fluoride?
I could start with that and say that one thing that's abundantly clear is that people with diminished kidney function have an impaired ability to excrete fluoride from their body. And as a result, you absorb and incorporate and accumulate more fluoride that you ingest into your body. So it's well known and it's been well established for many decades that people with kidney disease are a susceptible population to suffering any of the harms that fluoride can cause. So there, as we talked about earlier, there is evidence linking fluoride exposure to reduce thyroid function and thyroid hormone alterations. So it would stand to reason that someone who has diminished kidney function would be at elevated risk of suffering any thyroid-related harms that fluoride can cause.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, according to the Public Utilities Director, it'll take at least 4 years to implement this. However, proponents are saying that this is a COVID emergency. How does fluoridation impact COVID? Or I think another way of asking their question is something that's going to take 4 years to implement really a COVID emergency? I'm not sure if it's a rhetorical question, but.
Absolutely not. And just to answer the question about its effects on COVID, fluoride certainly has an impact on the immune system. Anything that drops the immune system or affects the immune system adversely is going to increase your risk of COVID or contacting COVID or curing yourself from COVID if you do get it. So yeah, water fluoridation is a really poor means of looking at or treating or being involved with COVID in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, another big question that we're getting is, will we make this available? And I can answer that. Yes, this is being recorded right now, and we are going to make this available on our Facebook page, on our YouTube page, as well as to our email list and to counselors. So the next question, what do they intend to do? I think they're talking about the council, but what do they intend to do for children who are severely allergic to fluoride? And I should note to panelists that the proponents have urged the council to install one fluoride-free faucet somewhere in the city. So in other words, how will this affect those who are severely allergic and children? And is a fluoride-free faucet somewhere in the city a sufficient answer to that?
That doesn't make sense. I mean, are we expecting mothers with children and toddlers and groceries taking public transportation to now haul their water from one source? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think, this whole thing is the disproportionate impact on people. If you don't fluoridate in Spokane and someone wants fluoride, they can easily get it. And as simple as brushing their teeth with fluoridated toothpaste, which is the most appropriate delivery system. But if someone doesn't want fluoride and you put fluoride in the water, the impact on that person's life is huge. We've heard from Julie Sims already that the impacts on her life. It's disproportionate impacts. I mean, that's what councillors have to weigh. They've got constituents, some who are saying we don't want it, some who are saying that they do want it. Those that do want fluoride can get it without imposing it on other people. Those that don't want it and you force it on them are in a mess. I mean, my wife and I, because we live in a fluoridated community now, we drive 20 miles to go to a spring to fill up 20 to 40 gallon jugs of spring water every couple of weeks and so on. Now we're retired. We have the time. We're middle class. We don't have a lot of money, but we can afford that. But somebody on low income can't do that. They probably don't have a car, number one, and number two, they don't have the time to do that. It's a disproportionate impact. This is what I think decision makers have to say. Look at the people in your community. You've got some who want it, some who don't want it.
Okay, next question. Does fluoride biodegrade after entering the ground or after wastewater treatment?
Absolutely not. Fluoride is the ion of an element. The elements cannot be destroyed. Elements can join with other elements. Ions can combine with other ions, but it is permanent. And there's one issue I'd like to bring up since we're looking at a little bit of chemistry now. The proponents love to talk about natural fluoride. Well, fluoride is naturally in the water at very low levels. The average naturally occurring where you're not fluoridated is about 0.1 parts per million. So if we fluoridate at 0.7, you're increasing by nearly 1 order of magnitude. But what is natural fluoride? What does the word natural mean in this context? It means geology. It means the water flowing through rocks pick up fluoride if there are fluoride compounds in those rocks. Now, that does not mean it's natural in the sense that that's what biology, that's what nature has given us. The rocks came first, biology came second. Biology had to deal with the elements that were in those rocks and in our soils and so on. And I think the evidence, the research evidence, which is I find fascinating, since 2012, they have found in a number of organisms, like bacteria, like fungi, that when the fluoride reaches a certain level, it switches on genes which produce proteins which act as a pump. They pump the fluoride out of the cells, which tells you something about nature's
your computer easier to use.
Nature's attitude to fluoride. Nature knows that fluoride is incompatible with biochemistry. It strikes at the heart of biology. And as has already been pointed out, there's no need for, by our systems, by any tissue in the body, there is no need for fluoride. No one has ever established that it is, as Dr. Bob said, it's not an essential nutrient. And so we're on a hiding to nothing. There is nothing it's useful for, but it can do a lot of harm. And just to finish off this train of thought, by the time you get to mammals, we don't have these pumps which pump fluoride out of the cell. We have kidneys. So about half the fluoride that we get in each day from all sources, the kidney gets rid of. That's the first defense mechanism that we have, the kidney. You get rid of it out of the body. The rest of when the fluoride goes through the kidney, 50% gets squirted out. The other 50% continues in the bloodstream, and then the bones take it up. The hard tissues, the bones in particular, take up the fluoride. This is a defense mechanism, but over a lifetime, it's a threatening mechanism because that fluoride accumulates in the bones and eventually makes your bones more fragile, hence the discussion of increased hip fracture, hence the discussion earlier of osteosarcoma and the other discussion of arthritis interfering with the connecting tissue to the bone.
I want to follow up on what Paul said about what is natural fluoride. I think it's actually important to understand that humans evolved not drinking groundwater. People didn't dig wells in caveman times. And surface water is low in fluoride, the 0.1 or less, almost everywhere. It's almost never find it higher. It's groundwater, which only in the last 1,000 years, which evolutionarily is nothing, that in some areas has elevated fluoride, 1 parts per million, rarely higher than that, but in places in China there are. But humans and most mammals never evolved being exposed to the levels of fluoride that we are now from artificial fluoridation or from drinking water from wells. So we have, as Paul said, we have not developed defense mechanisms, detoxification methods that say the fungi and the bacteria might have, which didn't have the option. They live in, the ocean or something.
And of course, another defense mechanism that we do have is mother's milk. Mother's breast milk contains very, very, very little fluoride. So the breast knows something. It's a protective mechanism. The mother's milk protects the baby from fluoride. But when you bottle feed your baby, you're giving approximately 200 times more fluoride than that baby would get from breast milk. And hence that a very important study that Chris was talking about earlier by Christine Till just a few months ago now, that compared the IQ of babies that were bottle fed in a fluoridated community versus babies that were bottle fed in a non-fluoridated community. A 9 IQ point drop. This is huge, huge. But
that's more than lead.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be a pretty severely lead poisoned child to give them a 9 IQ point loss. And these days, that just doesn't happen other than from lead paint in a few places if a child's eating lead paint. So fluoride could be worse than lead.
And again, it goes back to the equity issue. If you fluoridate Spokane and a parent wants to bottle feed their baby, they doesn't want to breastfeed, wants to bottle feed their baby, if they're low income, it's going to be difficult for them to get spring water or bottled water. This is just not fair. You've trapped a community because of the economic status, and they're punishing their infants with 200 times more fluoride than in mother's milk.
I wanted to make one more, I guess, analogy with this IQ issue and fluoride. And I've looked a lot at lead because that's sort of the type example of something that has been found to lower IQ and other harm too, neurotoxic harm. It was decades before scientists and doctors could convince politicians, basically, and industry that the lead in gasoline was causing severe harm. And once it was removed from gasoline, lead levels in children dropped precipitously by a factor of 10 or 20. Since the 1970s were when it was at its peak, and today they're 20 times lower. And before that, there was 50 years of the lead paint industry promoting lead and denying that lead paint was a harm. So, and the arguments that the defenders of lead, and it included government agencies who went along with the industry, said, oh no, the evidence isn't strong enough. These studies aren't convincing us. So fluoridation, the strong evidence has only been around for maybe 10 years. It started before then, and really only the last 3 years have the very strong studies. So I'm not actually surprised that the dentist promoters just cannot even believe the possibility that fluoride actually could be lowering IQ and are in total denial. And of course, the CDC, who has promoted fluoridation, they don't want to even admit that this is a possibility. But when you look at lead, the same thing happened. Same thing happened. It took a long time and a lot of effort by scientists, health advocates, and medical people to get that changed.
To wit the saying, get the lead out.
Yep. And there was enormous harm caused in those decades of not regulating lead in paint, in lead solder, and in gasoline especially.
Okay, the next question, we actually had several people ask a similar question, but does boiling water remove fluoride? Or somebody else asked, does a Brita filter remove fluoride? And this might be a good opportunity to describe what does remove fluoride.
Well, the answer to the question is no and no. Boiling actually increases the fluoride concentration, not lowering it, because you boil off the water and the fluoride, which is part of a compound, either sodium fluoride, calcium fluoride, will remain as the solid. It doesn't come off in the steam when you're boiling. That's number one. Number two, the cheap filters, the activated carbon filters like Brita, do not remove fluoride. you're going to need something like reverse osmosis or tabletop distillation to get distilled water, or by spring water. And I don't know, Chris, you've done a lot of studies on what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, they're all expensive, but the common filters do not remove fluoride. It's a very small ion. It isn't easily captured by the carbon filters. But reverse osmosis is effective. It's not practical for some people. Obviously, you have to have it built in, and it can be expensive. Distillation units work, but they use a lot of electricity. They're expensive. There are a few filters specifically intended to remove fluoride. However, I have looked into some of them. There are no government standards for removing fluoride with filters. So they can claim to remove it, and they can even say, you know, they've had it tested, but it's buyer beware. And they're expensive too. So trying to remove it after it's added to drinking water doesn't make any sense at all.
And it's all still limited protection, because every time you go downtown and have a cup of coffee in Spokane, you're going to get fluoride. Every time you eat a meal in Spokane, if the water is fluoridated, you're going to get fluoride in that meal. Any other drinks that are made with tap water, you're going to get. And then when you go to a friend's house, if they haven't put in the expensive reverse osmosis, you're going to get it from them. Once it's in the water, it is very, very difficult to protect yourself. And my advice to citizens is put the effort in now to prevent this nonsense from happening. Every minute that you spend now, rather than waiting till it's gone in, will save you a lot of money and a lot of angst. Put the effort in now to make sure this doesn't happen.
The other place that you'll find it in is beer. Most beer is brewed in cities with fluoridation. And the processing, they do not remove it from the water, most breweries. Now it depends. If there is a brewery in Spokane, great, drink that beer. But I've looked at it, and most beers in the United States end up being brewed in breweries with using fluoridated water.
Yeah, and if you're looking at beer, there's a limit to how much water people can drink, but there's no limit as far as students are concerned to how much beer they can drink. No limit at all.
All right. The next question is, should our pets be drinking fluoride? Are there any studies on pets?
There's not that much studies directly on fluoridated water in pets, but there is one of the concerns is dog food, particularly, in any pet food that has bone meal as part of the food, as you know, crunched up and put into the meat. That can be high in fluoride because bone accumulates fluoride. So one of the, I think, interesting and concerning facts is if you look, you know, dogs have high rates of hypothyroidism. They have high rates of bone cancer, of osteosarcoma. They have high rates of osteoarthritis. And those are three health ailments that have been related to fluoride exposure in humans. And so I think there is there's reason for concern about the contamination of dog food. But fluoridated water is not going to be any help to the pets. That's for sure.
And I'd add that the fluoride in pet food, cat and dog food, isn't just from bone meal. A lot of those diets have added phosphorus because it's an essential nutrient. And guess what? They get that phosphorus from the phosphate fertilizer industry. It's not just fertilizer for plants. That's where phosphorus for feed, animal feed, comes from. And they have different grades, and some of the grades are called defluorinated because they're aware that phosphate rock naturally has high levels of fluoride in it. And different pet food manufacturers will use different grades. Humans, phosphorus is added to Coca-Cola and other sodas as phosphoric acid. That also can come from the phosphate industry, rock phosphate. And there's a special human grade where the fluoride is removed. Not that it's going to be good for you when it's in a bottle of Coca-Cola, but pet foods will save money and they won't necessarily use that fluoride-free grade of phosphorus. So pet foods, definitely, many of them have elevated fluoride in them.
Now, one of our really creative activists is from Dallas, Texas. Her name is Regina Imberlio, and she set up a group called Dogs Against Fluoridation. Obviously not run by dogs, but in the name of dogs, for dogs, because of the kind of things that Michael and Chris have been talking about.
All right. Our next question is, how many studies are there that link fluoride to brain harm?
Well, the NTP did a systematic literature review where they searched, all the scientific studies ever published, and then they had criteria for which ones were relevant, and they found it's now up to 185 human studies of fluoride and brain harm, neurotoxicity, and so their report that I discussed, that's exactly what they've done, is try to look at the entire universe of scientific evidence, collect it all, rate it, and then sort of form conclusion. There's a lot. That's the human studies. As far as animal studies, where you feed it in a controlled experiment, there are over 300. I think it's up to 400 now. There's a lot of studies. And when the fluoridation promoters say, oh, no, there's no evidence, or they criticize one particular study, they are in a fantasy world when they're criticizing the evidence. I don't know where they come up with the claims that there's there's not a lot of evidence and there's not strong evidence.
Okay. The next question is, I heard fluorosilicic acid mostly comes from China now. Is this true?
I think, and I haven't looked at this recently, but the status as of like 5 or 6 years ago when I did look at it is, I believe China is principally supplying the sodium fluoride that's used in smaller, like in towns, not in the big cities. And fluorosilicic acid, which is the liquid, is still, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that the liquid fluorosilicic acid is still principally coming from the fertilizer industry here in the United States. But the sodium fluoride, the powder, is increasingly coming from China. And I think that there have been questions raised about what the quality control, if any, they have for that product.
There's also a solid form of silicofluorides, which I believe, same situation, is increasingly coming from China. And some, again, usually smaller water systems use these solid forms instead of the liquid.
But that would make sense in terms of shipment. If you're shipping from China, it would make more sense to ship a solid than a liquid, because you'll be shipping a lot of water if it's a 23% solution. So it's sodium hexafluorosilicate, the sodium salt of the hexafluorosilicic acid. The water districts prefer, even though the stuff is very, very nasty, and people that work in the departments which deliver the fluoride don't like handling this hexafluorosilicic acid. It's a fuming liquid. The fumes are hydrogen fluoride. It tends to corrode any metals and etch the glass in the small room where the material is stored. It's very, very toxic if the workers get it spilt on them. It's not a nice stuff to handle. But from a delivery point of view, it's easier to meter out a liquid than it is to meter out a solid. Or at least if you accept the solid, then maybe there's a step where you dissolve the solid in a bulk solution and then add the bulk solution. But these are all little, getting us further and further away from the point that you don't want to deliberately add a very toxic substance into the drinking water that's going to damage or risk damaging the child's brain.
And I would add to that that last week when the, I believe it was the water system engineers were talking about the actual, the chemical, you know, and the workers, these are extremely hazardous. And they gave the impression that it could be handled safely. Well, Phyllis Mullinex was the neurotoxicologist who did that first study back in '95 on animals, which was finding that fluoride is neurotoxic. She lost her job at Harvard because she dared to publish that paper. She won a lawsuit against Harvard, but she lost her job. Since then, she has been a consultant to legal cases, often of water system employees who were harmed by handling these very hazardous, the powders, the dust, and the acid. And she has successfully won in civil lawsuits, you know, compensation for these people. Some of them who've had permanent harm from their exposures using this material. Don't let them fool you to say that this is innocuous or easily handled safely. It isn't.
Okay, and a quick follow-up. Someone asked when you were talking about the chemicals, what kind of fluoride chemicals most likely to be used in Spokane? And I'll just add the note, I think Spokane has a population of over 220,000 people. So it's a fairly large city.
I would say almost certainly hexafluorosilicic acid, H2SiF6.
Okay, and okay, the next question, can you just dump a large amount of a substance, I think they're talking about the fluoridation additive, amount of a substance into the river and avoid regulation under Clean Water Act?
No, absolutely not. And I can tell you a funny story here. In New York State, Johnstown, had decided to fluoridate secretly, but people didn't know about it. And then when they found out, of course, Merry Hell broke out, and the village of Johnstown, the town of Johnstown, was forced not to fluoridate. But meanwhile, they had accumulated several barrels of hexafluorosilicic acid. And they put out this urgent memo. We have to find another town that's fluoridating to get rid of this chemical, because within a month it's going to revert to being a hazardous waste, and we're going to be paying something like $500 a container to get rid of it. So again, underlining this difference of the notion of it being a product and it being a hazardous waste.
Okay. Someone writes, my training tells me that fluoride competes with magnesium, which is estimatedly that 80% of the population is deficient.
Well, it wouldn't exactly compete with magnesium. Fluoride is one of the best complexing agent in the periodic table. The fluoride ion forms complexes with every metal ion in the body except the alkali metals, the sodium, potassium, rubidium, cesium. So it clusters around. It's a very small, highly negatively charged entity, and it is attracted to any positive ion or any positive charge anywhere. So it's going to be attracted to free magnesium ions. It's going to be attracted to places where the magnesium ion is maybe on a protein. And it's going to interfere with enzymes which have metal centers. There's all kinds of reasons why fluoride is incompatible with biochemistry. And one of them is this attraction for calcium. It interferes with calcium. And as you know, It isn't just bones where the fluoride is attracted to calcium. Calcium is used as a messenger in very small quantities. It triggers neurotransmission. And that's the way we control things. The message goes down the neuron, and to send the message on, you allow calcium into the synapse, into the neuron, and boom, it releases the neurotransmitter. So fluoride could interfere with all kinds of calcium chemistry. Fluoride could interfere with all kinds of magnesium chemistry and form complexes which no longer can be used as the free magnesium ion, and many, many other metal ions. It forms a complex with aluminium and helps to get aluminium into the brain. It may facilitate the uptake of lead because it forms a complex with lead. So there are many, many reasons why nature has got rid of fluoride where it can. And we are crazy, absolutely insane to deliberately add it to the drinking water supply.
Okay, the next question. The contract the city will have to sign to receive the grant from Delta Dental requires that the city fluoridate for 20 years. What scenarios could end fluoridation in that time?
Well, one scenario would be for our lawsuit. If the court finds that there is an unreasonable risk, then the court will order the EPA to initiate a rulemaking proceeding to eliminate that risk. So, how do you eliminate the risk posed by adding fluoridation chemicals to drinking water? We submit that the way you eliminate that risk is you don't add the chemicals to water. So if EPA would do a rulemaking proceeding, and if EPA reaches that conclusion, then EPA would have the authority to ban fluoridation nationwide. EPA has that authority. So that's certainly what we hope happens from this litigation. And that would be one potential.
Okay, and we have a follow-up from the gentleman who asked about the tonnage. Says, learning the actual estimated annual tonnage of fluoride proposed for Portland's water supply led to strong opposition from the Portland Sierra Club and the Columbia Basin Intertribal Fish Commission. If it has been estimated that Spokane will spend $600,000 annually, it's fair to say that will require probably 30 to 50 tons. Dilution makes the dose. So can anyone say how adding that much F will affect our local downstream bodies, i.e. the Spokane River, the Long Lake, which have been and continue to already be burdened by a heavy chemical load? So it sounds like an environmental question of 30 tons of hydrofluorosilicate acid in just going into the Spokane River. Could that have an ecological impact?
I don't know whether Rick North is on this, but he's from Portland, and it was an issue. And the environmental issue, which I think gained the most traction as far as the fluoride going into the waterway, was that there have been studies finding that salmon, their homing instinct, their migration upriver is hindered by fluoride, even at very low levels. And there have been some cases on the Columbia River where salmon migrations were being affected by fluoride that was released, I believe it was from industry, but if a major city was discharging into a river, that could have that too. Now, other fish, it's not as clear, not many studies have been done, but specifically for migratory fish, even very low levels of fluoride disrupted their homing ability. And so other wildlife can be affected at very low levels that would occur.
Okay, thank you. The next question: if fluoride is a difficult thing for some to access, but not right for everyone, why not save money by offering free fluoride prescriptions for those who cannot access it?
Well, I'd like to address that real quick. No doctor can write a prescription for someone who's not a patient of record. So you wouldn't be able to find a physician or a dentist to write a prescription for, a blanket prescription for this prescriptive drug for anyone. And so the city would have to distribute the fluoride. And I've contacted fluoride manufacturers, and they're very willing to sell at a reasonable discount. I think it was about $10 per person per year that it would cost to get fluoride tablets for those who wanted it. So if the city just said, we're going to dispense fluoride in the water, which I don't think is legal, but they're going to dispense it that way, why not dispense the fluoride with tablets? And that way, at least you give people the freedom of choice. However, Port Angeles decided not to do that either.
Well, Bill, one of the remarkable facts about fluoride, which I think was a shock to me, and I think it's a shock to a lot of people, is that fluoride tablets, they've been prescribed by doctors and dentists since the 1950s. And you need a prescription for them. You can't just go to the pharmacy, you can't go to a grocery store and buy fluoride tablets like you can buy calcium tablets. But despite the fact that they are prescribed by doctors and dentists, the FDA has never approved fluoride tablets as safe or effective. They remain, after over 60 years on the market, they remain an unapproved, in the FDA's term, an unapproved new drug. Unapproved new drug. And they've been on the market for over 60 years. Over 60 years. And they've never gotten around. No fluoride tablet maker has ever submitted sufficient evidence to get FDA to say safe and effective.
I contacted one manufacturer and asked them for the FDA number of approval because they said it was FDA approved, but they never got it for me because there is no FDA approved NDA number. You're absolutely right, Michael. It's not an approved drug, and that FDA says an unapproved drug is an illegal drug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this court case, we got a very, very informative declaration from the FDA, and we're going to release that. But it spells out FDA's approach to fluoride tablets, and it states never approve them. Do not, and they actually, the FDA is encouraging and asking fluoride tablet makers to submit the evidence that would allow the FDA to make a safe and effective determination. But the idea that we don't have, that evidence has never been submitted to the FDA, and the FDA has never approved it, and yet we're adding the same level of fluoride that is put in those pills that kids swallow. We're adding the same level of fluoride to our water supply. It's pretty striking.
Michael, it's even worse than that. Well, of course, give you time and you could say more than I am. But when I give a prescription, I gave it to my children. Sorry, Evie and Christy. I shouldn't have, but I didn't know any better back then. And I prescribed it for my children. When I prescribed it, it was a tablet, very precise dosage. When we do it in water, not everybody drinks the same amount of water. Some drink 1, 2 liters, sometimes over 10 liters of water per day. So the dosage is uncontrolled when we put it in water. With a tablet, it's controlled.
Mm-hmm. And the FDA, and if you think about the medical ethics component to this whole debate about fluoridation, the FDA considers fluoride a drug when added to toothpaste to prevent tooth decay.
Yes.
The FDA considers fluoride a drug when added to pills to prevent tooth decay. So why is it, and how could it be that fluoride added to water to prevent tooth decay is not a drug? And if it is a drug, shouldn't there be the same kind of protections for informed consent for each individual, whether they want to use that drug or not?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's guess. Okay, I got two people who've asked for Michael. Best guess, but they've asked different ways. But best guess, will the judge rule before the end of 2021? When will the judge rule? Essentially, you got two questions of when.
Well,
when that could potentially happen.
I have to be a little humble here, because I never would have predicted that more than 2 months after we completed our trial, that we still wouldn't have a ruling. So I have, this is not your normal case. So we are dealing with a national policy, and I think the court is being extra sort of diligent in just wanting to get every bit of information the court can get. So that said, I do believe the court will make a decision in 2021. And I believe that decision, and I hope that decision will be in the earlier part of the year. But this is not your normal case. And if you asked me when I thought the court would make its decision a year ago, I would have been proven very wrong as we sit here today.
There's just one thing I'd like to say here. I'm so pleased that people have tuned into this. I'm glad we've had at least one councillor looking in. We've probably attracted people with an open mind who, like ourselves, are open to reasoned argument, and the Fluoride Action Network, which I've been the director of for many years, on and off. So is Bill and so is Michael. We are science-based, and much of this discussion is science-based arguments. But we have to recognize, out of these confines, science doesn't rule. Reason largely doesn't rule. Public relations rule, and who's got the most money gets the best public relations. We see that in politics all the time. What rules in this issue, and has ruled for 70 to 75 years, is authority. Authority. And so the poor people of Spokane are going to be subjected to a lot of PR from the promoters of fluoridation. And one of the skills that these people have had for over 70 years is keeping professionals away from the literature, keeping dentists, keeping doctors, keeping scientists away from the literature. Because the moment a scientist picks up this literature that we've talked about tonight, it's pretty clear which side you're going to come down on. And when in fact the scales are taken away from even people like the editors of JAMA Pediatrics, I thought what Chris shared with us tonight was so important, to listen to that podcast, or excerpts from that podcast, the discussion between those two editors who for years had been supporters of fluoridation based upon what? No reading of the literature, no reading of any of these IQ studies, but what their organizations told them, what the American Medical Association, what the American Dental Association, what the American Public Health Association. And these are words coming from the top levels of bureaucracies, which are promoting policy. And I don't know, it's very frustrating. I've been doing this for 24 years, and some of the others on this call have been doing it for longer. It's very, very difficult. I believe in science. I'm a scientist. I've been a scientist for many, many years. And for me, science rules. Science is the truth, rules. But that is not the way this issue has been conducted. And I'll give you one example, and I'm going to shut up. One example, in 1978, there was a white paper issued by the American Dental Association. And what they said to me was horrific as a scientist. They said, dentists do not need to be on top of the literature to be effective promoters of this practice of fluoridation. And a failure to do so is an overt neglect of professional responsibility. I mean, that's almost word for word. I just shudder at that. This notion of professionalism is that you go along with authority without tempering it with even reading the scientific. You didn't have to read the scientific literature. You're a member of the dental profession, you go and promote fluoridation. And I think Bill Osmondson could give us a similar story when he was taking his Masters of Public Health. Do you want to share that with us?
Well, yes. The last week of my Master's in Public Health, the instructor was going on and on about how we needed to follow policy. We needed to follow the administration. Wherever we go and work in public health, we must essentially obey. And so I raised my hand and I said, so what if the policy, the administrator, my boss tells me that I need to promote tobacco smoking? And the instructor was silent for a little bit. And then he said, you promote it, but don't do it to the best of your ability. I mean, it doesn't make any difference what the science says, because we in public health are not supposed to look at the science. We're supposed to be soldiers and fight the war. And you don't, and it's like any soldier, any military outfit, you obey, you follow directions. And that I left the public health and said, I'm not going to work there anymore. I can't blindly follow like some religious belief and not use my brain.
Yeah. Every state health department in the United States promotes fluoridation. They have a line to the Center of Disease Control. Sometimes the Center of Disease Control actually pays the salary of the dental director of each state. So you've got a chain of command from the Center of Disease Control to the health departments down through the local health departments, and they're all obeying one single word: policy. Policy is king, and when policy is king, science is a slave. So don't. Sorry.
Yeah, and CDC clearly states that they do not evaluate the science. That's not their job. They just promote policy. So Paul brings this good case about the ADA and the CDC.
Yeah.
Tell him, Paul.
Well, they're Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Whatever the ADA, let's be clear about this. The Center of Disease Control is a body of about 30,000 people based in Georgia, Atlanta. Okay, they have scientists. They have great scientists in every discipline imagined, but they are not running fluoridation. The people in the CDC that run fluoridation is the Oral Health Division, and the Oral Health Division is about 30 people. Nearly all of them have just a dental degree. I don't think they have a toxicologist amongst them. They only have one PhD who's an economist. And these are the people that are telling the world and the United States that fluoridation is safe and effective. Safe and effective. That is the mantra, and they back that up with one of the great public relations successes of all time. And that is that they say that fluoridation is one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. And that statement is quoted nearly every day somewhere in the world by a health department, a dentist, a doctor, a newspaper editor, a newspaper journalist, and it's just percolated throughout the world. And it is believed, it's almost a religion. You believe that fluoridation is safe and effective. You believe that the people that are opposed to fluoridation are crazy people. You believe that. That's what you're taught in dental school. And you believe what you were taught in dental school. And all this means is that that policy is not questioned. And we have the difficult task of chiseling away, and we have since 2020, chiseling away at this belief in a policy with our only weapon being science. But the science, I mean, that's the bad news. It's terribly difficult. But the good news is the science since 2017 has been the best science in I believe, any public health issue for years and years and years. So, the importance of that is that more and more scientists now have been given the green light. You can research fluoride. It's not a no-go area. When Phyllis Mullinex did that study in 1995 and showed that fluoride was neurotoxic for animals, she was fired. We've already heard that. She hasn't had a job in academia since. That sent a horrible message to researchers in our universities throughout the United States. Don't do work on fluoride, because if you find any problems, you're going to lose your credibility. You're going to lose your grants. You're going to maybe even lose your job. And the same thing happened to EPA scientists who questioned fluoridation. Anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dominate this discussion. Just a word of warning: beware of people that cite authority but don't give you any science on which that authority is supposed to be based. Because when you look for it, as Michael did in this court case, the authority was not there. The CDC didn't have the science, the EPA didn't have the science, the FDA didn't have the science, and certainly the chemical manufacturers didn't have the science which showed that fluoride was safe. They didn't, they don't.
Okay, we, just so folks know, we've been going for almost 3 hours, and this will end in the next 8 minutes, as I think was our schedule. And so we really appreciate all the questions are still rolling in online and here on the forum. So I'll just let the folks know we'll get to your questions that weren't answered on Facebook over the next 12 hours or 24 hours, and on YouTube. And we'll work on the last questions, or 2 or 3 questions that we have here of participants who have been sitting with us now for almost 3 hours, so that we're very appreciative that you're participating. So one of the questions is, what are the legal options for us if this passes city council? And that's kind of, I guess I understand it's a kind of a tough one for folks, because you guys may not be Spokane residents, but.
Well, I think one thing you should explore is the process by which they tried to sneak this practice in during the COVID crisis. I think there are steps that were taken by I think the president of the council, which don't bear much scrutiny as far as democracy. I mean, people have died for our democracy. It has been sidestepped here. I mean, the other side had two meetings with the council. The pro-fluoridation people had the ear in private, I think, with the council, but the opponents of fluoridation were not given the same access. And that's why we have this forum tonight, to try to reach the people and councillors that were prepared to listen tonight, regardless of the dictatorial measures taken by the president of the council. I suspect a good lawyer could have a meal with that in terms of process, but I'm not a lawyer.
Okay, and for that person answering the question, I just urge you to, one, if you beat this now, if the city councilors have said, send your emails, phone them, share your stories with them, and because the vote is Monday, so this is your opportunity to defeat it before you have to take legal action. And in worst case scenario, I think there's a lot to learn from the people of Portland who were able to reject the practice after their council approved it.
Yeah. Every dollar you spend now trying to stop it will have to be multiplied by 1,000 later if you try to stop it after this decision's made. Every minute that you spend here would be multiplied 10,000 or more times if you have to fight it after it's gone in. So all the effort that you could put in writing, phoning, emailing your councillors, that's where the effort has to go. It really has to go.
And I guess probably the last question we have time for is, if fluoridation is so safe, why did Delta Dental include a liability waiver in their contract with Spokane?
That's a very good question.
They all have liability waivers. The chemical manufacturers, Mosaic has a waiver. National Sanitation Foundation that approves the chemicals added to water, they all have a waiver.
The American Dental Association has a waiver. Literally, the dentists, the ADA is basically a trade association of dentists, but they state that, you know, you don't hold them to anything they say.
Yeah. You know, I think it's a wonderful story about the ADA. You know, before the ADA promoted fluoridation, they were avid and still are promoters of mercury amalgam. And they gave dentists merry hell that didn't use mercury amalgams if they were to announce in public or tell their patients that it was a danger, that putting mercury in someone's mouth was a danger to health. They could lose their license. And dentists who used and went along with the, you know, the ADA's tyrannical power in this respect, there were about 100 of them, I think, who were sued, or so I don't know the number. The number of dentists were sued because of mercury amalgams, and they did the reasonable thing. They went to the ADA and said, "You've been telling us we got to use mercury amalgams, and if we tell people they're dangerous, we lose our licenses. Also, will you help us with the lawsuit?" No. The ADA wouldn't help those dentists at all.
It doesn't inspire confidence that the ADA, back in the middle of the 19th century, was promoting mercury in dental fillings, and it still supports mercury in dental fillings 150 years later. So I think when that change on this issue for the United States and all the municipalities within it, for us to develop safer policies with respect to fluoride, not adding it to water, you know, and making sure that kids aren't swallowing too much toothpaste. These are reforms that are absolutely going to have to occur outside of the dental community. The dental community is not going to reform. The organized dental community is unfortunately not going to reform itself on this issue. And I think we need basically the environmental health community and other sectors to step up and maybe help the dental community bring about some change here.
In a lawsuit that a dentist made against the American Dental Association, the American Dental Association testified in court that they have no duty to protect the health of the public. The American Dental Association is there to protect the American Dental Association and its members, the dentists, not the public. And that's reasonable in my opinion, but we don't rely on them to protect the public.
All right. Well, I really appreciate everybody on the call. I'm not for those listening, please visit www.safewaterspokane.org for more information. Also follow us on Facebook, Safe Water Spokane. Please use the next several days to send personalized emails sharing your stories, your concerns with city councilors, particularly those on the fence like Mum, Kinnear, Burke, and Stratton, who've expressed concern themselves but haven't made a decision. Also, please use the next few days to call the city councilors as well. I'm not sure, Jeff, do you have any closing words you'd like to say? Or
other than thank you all the panelists for a job well done. I think we've looked at thoroughly a lot of the concerns, and I would like everybody to encourage other folks to go ahead and encourage people to see this, to look at this, and they can reach that, Stu, correct, on our website there.
Yep.
safewaterspokane.org. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email us or get hold of us, because any of these people would be willing to give more expertise or more advice on those things.
okay, with that, we thank everybody for joining us this evening, And please urge your counselors to vote no on Monday.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Hasta
Good
luego.
Thanks
luck.
to all the attendees. Good questions.
Yes.